Sunlight was softly filtering through the tall windows of the ancient university building. In the auditorium of the prestigious educational institution where he studied, Barron Trump, there was a concentrated silence. Today's lecture was dedicated to human rights and civic participation, one of the most important topics in modern society. Professor Richard Stanford, a person with rich academic background, famous liberal views, walked slowly in front of the students like a great orator, choosing his words so that each sentence sounded weighty. He was a man who did not tolerate objections. His lectures were full tough statements, and although Hellicky to call himself a defender of freedoms, his manner of presenting information left little room for alternative points of view. Barron sat in the center of the audience, without attracting attention to itself. Despite its surname, he didn't like to take advantage of privileges and tried to be like everyone else. But this day promised to change everything. Professor started with the usual theses. We live in an era when every citizen must be aware of his or her role in the state. Human rights are a fundamental element of a democratic society. The students listened attentively, taking notes. Barron also recorded he respected all opinions, even if he did not agree with them. But then the professor abruptly changed the subject. However, despite all the achievements of civilization, we are still held back by one problem. This is religion. Audience froze. Some students exchanged glances, not understanding what the professor was getting at. Barron became wary. Religion is a relic of the past. It hinders science, slows down progress, and turns people into fanatics. People who still believe in God simply do not want to accept reality. Some students nodded, but part of the audience sat up. A few guys from conservative families bowed their heads, clearly feeling uncomfortable. Barron felt a wave of disagreement rising inside him. The professor goes too far. Professor went wild. God is a myth. If we want to develop, we need to give up these fairy tales. Science has proven that religion is just a way to manipulate people. Modern man must be above this. Some students nodded, others nervously looked away. But nobody didn't dare to object. Barron looked around the audience. People who believed in God now felt themselves humiliated. He clenched his fists. At that moment he realized he cannot remain silent. He took a deep breath and stood up. Professor noticed movement and stopped, raising his eyebrows in surprise. Mr. Trump? Do you have a question? Audience immediately perked up. Barron never tried to attract attention, but now everyone was looking at him. He nodded slowly. Yes, I have a question, Professor. Professor crossed his arms over his chest. I'm listening. Barron looked straight at him. You say that faith is a relic of the past. That people who believe in God are lagging behind progress. But aren't you currently violating the main principle of human rights, freedom of religion? The audience tensed. Professor frowned. I'm just stating scientific facts. Barron did not retreat. Facts or personal opinion? You teach a course on human rights. Isn't the human right to believe or not to believe part of democracy? Some students, they whispered quietly. Professor sighed irritably. Mr. Trump, I'm just saying that religion is a relic. Science has proven that there is no God. We have to move forward. Barron looked at him calmly. Has science proven this? Or is this your personal belief? Professor fell silent for a moment. Barron continued. Science and religion are not always opposites. Many great scientists, Newton, Pascal, Einstein, did not deny the existence of God. They saw science as confirmation of a higher intelligence. Some students nodded. Barron took a step forward. Freedom of speech is the right of every person to express their opinion. But when you say that all religious people are a relic of the past, you insult millions of people who made this choice consciously. Is this freedom? Or is this already the imposition of one's point of view? In the audience there was silence. Some students looked at Barron with admiration. Others were confused. Barron didn't attack, but spoke confidently. Professor pursed his lips. Interesting point, Mr. Trump. Perhaps we should discuss this further. Barron he sat down, but knew that this argument was just beginning. He looked around and realized He gave a voice to those who were afraid to speak. Now it's up to him had to defend their position. The audience was waiting a real intellectual battle. And that was just the beginning. Audience froze. All eyes were on Barron Trump, which exhaled barely noticeably, but did not flinch. He never liked to attract attention. Since childhood he was taught that people would judge him not by his merits, but by his last name. But now couldn't keep silent. Professor Richard Stanford looked at him with expression hidden irritation. Barron understood, this man is not used to students arguing with him. But today there will be an exception. Professor adjusted his glasses and grinned. Interesting. You talk about freedom of opinion, but religion is an instrument of control. How can you defend something that restricts people's freedom? Barron didn't blink. But isn't the same thing happening now, Professor? Professor frowned. What do you mean? Barron continued calmly. You say that faith is a relic. But if someone in this room believes in God, he automatically becomes backward by your logic? Isn't this an attempt to impose your point of view? Isn't this a restriction of freedom of opinion? In the audiencia a whisper ran through. Professor thought for a moment, but then decided to attack differently. Mr. Trump, we live in the age of science. Do you really deny progress? Do you really want to go back to the Middle Ages, when the Inquisition burned people for their beliefs? Barron didn't look away. Science and religion are not enemies. You say that faith hinders progress? But what about Nikola Tesla, Isaac Newton, Louis Pasteur? They were believers. Didn't their discoveries lead us to progress? Students started exchanging glances. Professor felt like the situation was getting out of control. He's used to it. Dominate the audience, but Barron was not an ordinary student. Barron did step forward. His voice sounded more confident. Professor, you are talking about freedom? Then why shouldn't people have the right to choose? Why should someone decide for them what to believe? If we truly respect human rights, we must protect the right of everyone, believer and atheist, to make their own choice. The audience froze. Some the students nodded, others looked at the professor with embarrassment. He suddenly felt like he was losing his audience. And this was a new sensation for him. He decided to use last argument. But how can you believe in something that has not been proven? Where is your evidence for the existence of God? Barron smiled with the corner of his lips. Professor, do you have any proof that God does not exist? There was silence. Barron continued. You teach a course on human rights. You should teach us to respect different views, not to impose yours. If a person decides to believe, that is his right. If he does not believe, that is also his right. But when you say that God is a myth and label millions of believers as backward, you are doing exactly what the Church did in the Middle Ages. Are you saying that they were wrong? Then why are you doing the same thing now? Professor Freeze. In the hall the first applause was heard. They were unsure, but sincere. Students who first were afraid to speak now started supporting Barron. He's right. We should have the right to choose, someone said. Freedom of speech is freedom of all opinions, not just convenient ones. Even those who were not religious began to understand what Barron protects: not only faith, but also the very principle of freedom of opinion. Professor realized that I lost this round. He couldn't admit my mistake, but it was pointless to continue the argument in the same spirit. He exhaled heavily, gathered up the papers, and said, Okay. You may be right, Barron. Discussion over. But didn't look happy. This student became a problem for him. When the lecture was over, some students approached Barron. That was cool. You really showed him that he's not omniscient. Thank you for saying what we were afraid to say. But Barron didn't smile. Heffelt, what now will be noticed more. Professor will not forgive him for this defeat. And most likely, this is not the end yet. After the lecture there was tension at the university. News about how Barron Trump publicly questions Professor's arguments spread across campus at lightning speed. Some students admired him, others were in shock, but all were waiting for the continuation. And at ICE it didn't take long to arrive. The next day the Professor Richard Stanford decided to regain control of the situation. When Barron entered the auditorium, he immediately felt the changes. On the board in large letters it was written, "Rationality versus faith, what makes us free?" He raised eyebrows. Professor Stanford stood at the lectern, holding a list of questions in his hands. "Today we will continue the discussion started by Mr. Trump." The audience perked up. Barron understood, this is not just a lecture. This open intellectual battle. Professor started confidently. "Yesterday Barron raised an interesting question. Can the denial of religion be considered a violation of freedom? Today I propose to discuss the opposite. Does faith hinder the development of the individual?" Barron didn't look away. Understood that the professor wants not just to continue the argument, but expose him to everyone. But he was ready. "Barron, if you talk about freedom, don't you think that religion makes a person dependent?" Professor deliberately walked slowly across the stage, as if leading students to a predetermined conclusion. Barron answered calmly. "Freedom is the ability to choose. If a person consciously chooses faith, he does not become dependent. Dependence is when you are forced to accept something. And faith is a personal decision." The students began to whisper. "Professor, I didn't expect such confidence." He changed tactics. "But religion has been used for centuries to suppress people. The Crusades, the Inquisition, isn't that proof that faith makes people cruel?" Barron met his gaze. "Hasn't science been used for the same purposes? Weapons of mass destruction, genetic experiments, nuclear bombs? Can't science itself be used for evil? But you don't call science a relic of the past. Why then should religion bear collective guilt for those who misused it?" There was a pause in the room. Some students began to applaud. Professor squinted. "You defend religion, but what does it give to a person except illusions? Isn't it more logical to live based on evidence, not on faith?" Barron nodded. "Logic is important. But a person is not just a set of formulas. We are guided not only by evidence, but also by values, intuition, emotions. We are looking for meaning. And everyone has their own. For some, meaning is in family, for others, in a career, for others, in faith. If for one person meaning is in science, and for another, in God, why should someone decide which meaning is correct?" Professor pursed his lips. "But if there is no evidence, why believe it?" Barron smiled. "Professor, do you believe in love?" That frowned. "Of course, but prove it scientifically." Professor was taken aback. The hall burst into applause. Now students boldly entered into the discussion. "Barron is right. Faith is a personal matter. Why should someone decide how we feel? Can we talk about freedom if we forbid belief?" Professor realized that he was losing control. He took a deep breath, approached the pulpit, and said, "Okay. I'm not trying to push my opinion. I just think the world needs to move forward and not cling to old ideas." Barron nodded. "I agree with that. We must move forward. But real progress is when all opinions are respected, not just the convenient ones." The hall exploded with applause. Barron understood who won. But also knew Professor will not forget this humiliation. When the lecture was over, students approached Barron. "You answered coolly. We were always afraid to argue with him. You've really proven that you're not afraid to tell the truth." But among them there were also those who looked at him with hostility. He became too noticeable. And T-Sit was just the beginning. After Barron Trump publicly responded to the professor, the university was buzzing. Students disagreed. Some admired his courage. Finally, someone was able to put the professor in his place. He always imposes his opinion. Barron didn't just argue, he actually proved his point. But others were critical. It was disrespectful. How can a student contradict a man who taught thousands of people? Trump just wanted attention. He will always be in the center because of his last name. One fact remained constant. Barron became what people talk about. And now had to deal with the consequences. Barron understood that this dispute would not go unnoticed by the teaching staff. And he turned out to be right. The next day, after classes, he received official announcement from the administration. Baron Trump, Professor Richard Stanford would like to speak with you in his office. Please see him today at 4:30 p.m. Baron I foresaw this conversation. But he didn't intend to retreat. When Barron entered, Professor sat at a massive oak table, folding his arms. He didn't look angry, but there was irritation in his eyes. Sit down, Mr. Trump. Barron sat down, remaining calm. Professor paused and then said, You put on a little show yesterday. Barron didn't blink. I have expressed my opinion. Isn't that the point of education, freedom of discussion? Professor pursed his lips. Freedom of discussion is one thing. But when a student questions a professor's opinion in front of the entire class, that's another. Barron leaned forward. So a student cannot express his opinion if it contradicts yours? Professor exhaled. You are just a young man who thinks he understands everything. But education is a process in which knowledge is passed on to you, not the other way around. Barron chuckled. So students are supposed to just agree with everything the professor says? That's not education. That's indoctrination. For the first time, the professor lost his composure. Look, Barron. You can play philosopher, but there are certain rules you have to follow here. You're not in the White House. Your father isn't dictating the terms. Barron froze. It was an obvious attack. He answered calmly. I don't speak for my father. I speak for myself. And I haven't broken any university rules. If you don't like what I said, it's because it offended you personally. And if a professor allows personal emotions to interfere with the educational process, shouldn't he reconsider his views? The professor fell silent. He realized that Barron outplayed him. You're smart, Mr. Trump. But I warn you, don't make enemies among the faculty. Barron stood up. I'm not afraid of this. Because you can't scare the truth. He turned around and walked out, leaving the professor alone with my thoughts. After their conversation, the professor began to act covertly. Some teachers began to regard Barron with suspicion. Several students began to avoid him, fearing that arguing with the professor might affect their grades. But there was another side. Many students began to see Barron as a man who was not afraid to tell the truth. Some teachers respected his courage and objectivity. The university's community magazine published an article about the debate, making Barron even more popular. But Hefeld, what is this? It's not over yet. Professor will not forgive him for this humiliation. And the battle for freedom of opinion was just beginning. After Barron Trump left the professor's office, Stanford Hefeld the tension. T-sit was more than just an argument. There was a clash of two worldviews. Freedom of choice versus dogmatic thinking. Respect for other people's opinions versus trying to suppress them. Barron understood. Now he is not just a student. Now he is a symbol of a debate that has gone beyond the classroom. And soon felt the consequences. A few days later, Barron received official notice from the university. Baron Trump, you are invited to a meeting with the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities. Barron was not surprised. He knew that the professor will not leave this situation without consequences. The meeting took place in a strict office, hung with paintings and awards. Dean, a man of about 60 with a cold look, folded his hands on the table and said, Mr. Trump, you probably already understand why you are here. Barron nodded. Because I told the professor the truth to his face? Dean kept his composure. You have questioned his authority. You have created a debate that has gone beyond the normal educational process. We do not support conflicts between students and teachers. Barron looked at him calmly. So the problem is not what I said, but what I dared to say. Dean pursed his lips. We want academic discipline to be maintained at the university. We would not like this to happen again. Barron caught the hidden hint. This unofficial warning. They want him to shut up. But Hay didn't intend to do this. Hesmeldan said, I respect the university and academic discipline. But I also respect freedom of speech and the rights of students to express their opinions. I have not broken any rules. If someone feels uncomfortable because a student dared to speak, maybe the problem is not with me? Dean looked at him carefully. He realized that Barron won't back down. After this meeting, a wave of support for Barron swept through the university. Some students began writing posts on social media saying that freedom of speech was more important than the convenience of teachers. The student newspaper published an article titled, "Can You Argue with a Professor?" Even some faculty members have come to Barron's defense, arguing that the university is a place for debate, not dogma. Barron understood. This is more than an argument. This is a fight for students' right to speak. And Althoff didn't strive for popularity. He found himself at the center of a real debate about freedom of opinion at the university. After a few weeks, the situation went beyond the university. Major media outlets began writing about Barron Trump's dispute with the professor. Some TV channels have discussed whether universities really suppress freedom of opinion. Reporters tried to get a comment from Barron, but he avoided publicity. But the one who couldn't keep silent was his father. Donald Trump in his interview said with a sarcastic smile, "My son is a smart guy. He understands that free speech is not a privilege, but a right. Perhaps the professor should learn a little from him." This only added fuel to the fire. Now even political circles began to discuss the situation. Some supported Barron, others they simply called him the president's kid who decided to put on a show. But Barron himself has not changed his position. He didn't want fame. He just wanted people to be able to talk. After much discussion and debate, the university administration made an official statement. Students have the right to freely express their views. Professors are required to respect different opinions. Any form of pressure on students for their beliefs is unacceptable. T-Sit was a real victory. Professor Stanford could not hide his disappointment, but officially could no longer suppress students if they did not agree with him. Barron realized that this case changed his life forever. He didn't want to be the center of attention, but became the voice of those who were afraid to speak. And now he knew this was just the beginning. Because freedom of speech is not something that can be simply taken and restricted. And I am ready to continue to defend her.